Hello, and welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you love old American history, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. Together, let's step back in time and uncover a story long buried in the past. Asterisk the year was 1895. America was caught between two worlds, the fading dust of the frontier and the rising hum of modern progress. Railroads stretched their iron arms across the deserts. Towns sprouted where only sagebrush had once been. And old saloons now shared the same streets as churches and post offices. Nevada was one of those places where the old and the new wrestled every day for dominance. The mines had already brought men with restless spirits, gamblers with empty pockets, and women with silent dreams. It was a land where fortunes rose overnight and just as quickly sank into the dust, leaving behind broken families and empty streets. It was in this restless Nevada landscape, in a small town near Virginia City, that a wedding took place on a warm spring afternoon in May of 1895. The church was a simple wooden structure, painted white but weather-worn by the desert winds. Its steeple rose modestly against the endless blue sky, its bells still bearing the marks of countless Sundays and hurried funerals. Inside, the pews were packed with townsfolk miners, with dust still on their boots, ranchers in freshly brushed coats, mothers with their children perched nervously on laps. Weddings were rare in this part of the state, and when they happened, the whole town came alive to witness them. The bride was a young woman named Clara Hayes. She was only 20 years old, but already she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had grown up in the rough embrace of the frontier. Her father, once a prospector who had lost everything in a gamble, had raised her with little more than grit and survival. Clara was known for her kindness, the way she always offered a hand to neighbors, the way she brought baskets of bread to widows in town, the way her laughter carried into the dusty street like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The groom was Thomas Blake, 25, a man who had arrived in Nevada only a few years earlier. He had worked as a clerk for the railroad and earned the respect of the town for his honesty and hard-working nature. His friends spoke of him as dependable, a man who rarely raised his voice, who kept to his word, and who looked at Clara as if she were the only thing keeping him grounded in a world of uncertainty. Their marriage was seen as a blessing, a new beginning not only for them but for the entire community. That day, the town photographer, a man named Henry Whitfield, was called to capture the memory. Henry was one of those men who treated his craft with reverence, lugging his heavy wooden camera and glass plates like sacred tools. In 1895, photography was still a patient, delicate art. The subjects had to stand still, faces calm, bodies unmoving, as the lens drank in their likeness with a slow, quiet hunger. People always felt a little nervous during these sittings. There was something about being frozen forever, something about the camera's unblinking eye that felt heavier than it should. After the ceremony, the couple stood outside the church, the sun bathing their faces in warm light. Clara's gown was simple, not made of silk or lace imported from the East, but of a fabric her mother had sewn with careful hands. Still, it carried beauty in its plainness, the kind of beauty that came from meaning rather than cost. Thomas stood tall beside her, his suit pressed but modest, his hand steady as it rested against hers. Behind them, the townsfolk gathered in a line, children fidgeting, women adjusting hats, men straightening ties. It was, to all eyes, an ordinary moment in a small American town. Henry adjusted his camera, set his tripod, and told everyone to hold still. The shutter clicked, capturing that frozen instant in time. No one that day could have imagined that nearly a century later, historians would pore over that very photograph, not because of Clara, not because of Thomas, not even because of the crowd that filled the background, but because of one disturbing detail that no one noticed at the time that at first glance, the photograph was typical of its era. The bride and groom stood proudly in the center, framed by the congregation of family and friends. The church doors loomed, open behind them, revealing the shadowy interior where candles still burned faintly from the ceremony. The edges of the photo had that slightly blurred softness common in glass plate photography. People who saw the photograph years later described it as beautiful, nostalgic, a perfect example of small-town life in 19th century Nevada. But the longer the eye lingered, the more unsettled the viewer became. Behind Clara and Thomas, near the far edge of the crowd, there was a face. At first, it seemed like just another guest, but closer study revealed something strange. The figure's clothing was out of place, not like the pressed coats or simple dresses of the others. Instead, it seemed faded, almost tattered, as if the person had stepped out of a different time altogether. Stranger still, the figure's expression was not one of joy or calm. The eyes were fixed directly on the bride with a sharp, almost hungry intensity. The lips curled in what some described as a half-smile, others as a grimace. And the most unnerving part of all when researchers cross-checked the names and records of everyone present that day. Not a single soul could identify the figure. The town's records were thorough. Nevada in the 1890s kept careful account of its citizens, especially in the smaller towns where everyone knew each other's business. Guests were written down, and even the photographer had listed names for his notes. Yet no mention was made of this figure. No family recalled them. No local historian could place them. It was as if the figure in the background had simply appeared only in the photograph, and nowhere else. For decades, the photograph remained in the hands of the Hayes family, tucked away in an album. It was not until the late 20th century, when a historian from Reno began collecting images of Nevada's past, that the unsettling discovery came to light. When enlarged, the details of the mysterious figure became clearer. The clothes looked older than 1895, more like something from the 1860s mining camps. The face, pale and worn, did not match the cheerfulness of the crowd. Some swore that when you looked long enough, the eyes seemed to follow you, their dark stare refusing to release. Whispers began to spread among historians. Who was this figure? Why had no one noticed them at the time? Some suggested it was simply a trick of light, a distortion common in old photography. Others believed it was evidence of an unrecorded guest, someone who had slipped into town unnoticed and vanished just as quickly. But there were those, particularly among older Nevada families, who remembered the stories of Virginia cities. Ghostly past of miners who had perished in cave-ins, of women who had vanished without explanation, of men who had met their end in lonely saloons. To them, the photograph was not just a mystery, but a haunting echo of unfinished lives. The strange thing was this: Clara herself never spoke of it. In all her letters, journals, and later years, she made no mention of the unsettling face and pins. Her wedding photo, did she never notice it? Or did she see it once and decide never to look again? No one could say. What is known is that her life after that day was not one of unbroken happiness. The marriage, at first, seemed blessed. Clara and Thomas built a small home just outside town, a place with a porch that looked out onto the wide Nevada sky. They planted flowers in the spring, raised chickens, and tried to carve out a future from the rocky soil. But misfortune soon found them. Their first child, a daughter, died in infancy. Neighbors said Clara's laughter was never quite the same after that. Thomas, too, seemed weighed down by grief, his quiet nature turning into long silences at the dinner table. And then, in the winter of 1898, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia and was gone within days, leaving Clara a widow before she had even turned 20-5. Through it all, that wedding photograph remained on her mantel. Visitors recalled that it was. Always there, framed in oak, the bride and groom, forever frozen in their brief joy. And behind them, always, that strange, uninvited face Dot. It would take nearly a century for anyone to notice it. But once they did, the questions began to unravel, and the story of Clara's wedding day became not just a memory, but a haunting. When the photograph finally began drawing serious attention in the late 20th century, it was more than just a curiosity for collectors. It became an obsession for those who studied Nevada's rough beginnings. The state's history was not tidy or polished. It was born out of dust, sweat, greed, and blood. Every boom town that sprang to life under the promise of silver and gold was just as quickly abandoned to rot when the veins ran dry. Churches and brothels were built side by side, saloons outnumbered schools, and every street seemed to hold a story of a man who had won or lost everything in a single night. That was the Nevada Clara and Thomas had known, and it was the Nevada that still lingered in old photographs. Like ghosts pressed onto paper got the photograph of the Hayes Blake wedding was first examined seriously by Professor Richard Alderman in 1978. Alderman was a historian from Reno who specialized in mining towns of the late 1800s. He had a reputation for finding the overlooked details in history's small notes and diaries, forgotten letters, anonymous graves on the edge of old cemeteries. When he first saw the photograph, it struck him as a simple but beautiful piece of small-town Americana. But the more he studied it, the more unsettled he became. He requested an enlargement. With careful hands, he had the glass negative scanned and magnified, bringing details into sharp clarity. That was when the figure in the background could no longer be ignored. It was not a smudge, not a shadow, not a mere accident of light. It was a man, tall and lean, his hair hanging long around his face, his clothing far more tattered than anyone else's in the photograph. He stood slightly apart from the group, not mingling with the others, yet not so far back that he could be dismissed as a passerby. His face was caught in that eerie half-expression, eyes fixed on Clara, lips curved in a way that seemed both mocking and mournful. Alderman was unsettled enough to begin digging. He searched through the church records for that year, the marriage documents, and the town's census lists. Everyone present that day was accounted for except this man. When he showed the image to surviving relatives of the Hayes family, none could identify him. Old-timers in town, by then in their 80s or 90s, shook their heads and said they had never heard mention of anyone like him being at the wedding. The mystery deepened. One evening, after weeks of staring at the photograph, Alderman wrote in his journal that the figure gave him a feeling he could not shake, a sense that he was looking at someone who should not have been there, someone who belonged to another time altogether. That sense was not far from the truth, for Nevada was a place where the past lingered heavily in the soil. Virginia City itself was a town soaked in memory. Only 30 years earlier, it had been one of the richest mining camps in the world, the beating heart of the Comstock Lode. Men from every corner of the earth had poured into its narrow streets, chasing the gleam of silver. Fortunes were made, but just as many were lost. The mines took lives daily. Cave-ins buried men alive. Fires swept through tunnels, choking miners in black smoke. Explosions tore bodies apart and left widows waiting at doorsteps. It was whispered in Virginia City, even long after the boom had faded, that the dead never left. Locals spoke of strange figures on the edge of photographs, of voices echoing in empty mine shafts, of shadows that crossed the street when no one was there. The Hayes wedding photograph seemed to echo those very whispers. Some believed the man was one of those lost miners, forever tied to the earth where his life had ended. Others thought he might have been a drifter who slipped into town, but if that were true, why had no one noticed him in life? Why had he been seen only in the captured moment, as though he had walked out of the shadows of memory into the frame of that photograph? As Alderman's research spread, more people came forward with stories. A woman in Carson City claimed her grandmother had once told her of a strange man seen on the edges of town gatherings, never speaking, never recognized, always watching. A retired railroad worker swore he remembered old-timers talking of a miner named Josiah Pike who had vanished during a cave-in in 1869. According to rumor, Pike had been seen after his death standing on street corners, glimpsed in saloon windows, staring through church doors during Sunday services. Could it have been Pike who appeared in Clara's wedding photo almost 30 years after his death? The idea took hold among locals. Josiah Pike became the name whispered when the photograph was shown, the name muttered with unease. But Alderman was not satisfied with folklore alone. He tracked down mining records from 1869. Indeed, a man named Josiah Pike had been listed among the dead after a collapse in the Savage mine. His body was never recovered. The possibility was chilling. The figure in Clara's wedding photo wore clothing that could easily have belonged to a miner from that decade, threadbare, soiled, and torn at the edges. His gaunt face and hollow eyes matched descriptions of Pike as a man who had worked the mines until his health wasted away. Could a man lost to the earth return only to stand silent and watching at a wedding nearly 3 decades later? Some scoffed, dismissing it as nonsense. They argued it was more likely an unknown transient, someone forgotten by history, captured accidentally on film. But others could not ignore the uncanny details, the way the man seemed not quite of the same sharpness as those around him, as if he stood in 2 places at once. Photographic experts brought in during the 1980s agreed on one point. The figure did not appear to be a double exposure or trick of light. He was there. The camera had recorded him. The mystery would have been enough to unsettle anyone, but the story gained darker weight when people began connecting it to the tragedies in Clara's life. She had lost her first child. She had lost her husband only 3 years after their marriage. Later, 2 of her brothers died in mining accidents, leaving her nearly alone in the world. By the time she reached her 40s, she was a woman marked by grief. Neighbors recalled seeing her sometimes on her porch in the evening, staring into the desert as if searching for something she could not name. The wedding photograph never left her home. It sat on her mantle through every loss, every hardship, every passing year. And though she never spoke of it, visitors who looked closely at the photo always felt unsettled, as though Clara herself must have known the shadow she carried in that frame. Historians later debated whether the photograph was cursed, or whether Clara's fate was simply part of the harsh world in which she lived. But among those who studied it closely, one question remained unanswered. Why did the man's gaze seem fixed only on Clara? Out of all the faces in that photograph, his eyes were locked on hers, as if the story of her life was already written. The ink pressed into the photograph before she even lived at by the early 1900s. Clara moved from Nevada to California, hoping for a fresh start. She carried the photograph with her, and when she died in 1932, it was found still framed on her dresser. The image then passed down through her relatives, tucked away until Professor Alderman uncovered its secret. From there, the photograph took on a new life, not as a family keepsake, but as a piece of history that carried both memory and mystery. It was displayed in exhibitions, written about in journals, whispered about in ghost stories. People stood before it and felt a chill creep along their arms. Some claimed they saw the figure's expression change the longer they stared. A few swore that when the photograph was left in a dark room, the man's shadow seemed to move ever so slightly. Whether truth or imagination, the wedding photograph of 1895 had become more than a record of love. It had become a window into grief, into Nevada's haunted past, and into the unexplainable threads that tie the living to the dead. and for the historians who studied it, one haunting question refused to fade. If a photograph could hold a man, long dead, what else might be hidden in the frames of America's forgotten past? By the time the photograph became an object of fascination in the late 20th century, its story had already seeped into the bones of Nevada like one of the old legends told around mining campfires. Families who had lived in Virginia City for generations spoke of it in hushed tones. Children grew up daring each other to look too long at the man's face, and more than one historian admitted privately that they felt uneasy being in the same room as the print. But the deeper researchers dug, the stranger the trail became. Professor Alderman, who had first brought the photograph into the public eye, never claimed it was supernatural. He was a scholar, cautious with his words. But in his notebooks, which were found after his death in 1986, there were private confessions that he never published. In one entry, written late at night, his script uneven, he wrote, "I have studied this photograph every day for 6 months. I do not dream of Clara, or Thomas, or even the joyous crowd. I dream only of the figure at the edge. His eyes follow me into sleep. I hear the sound of rocks falling, as though a mine is caving in. Sometimes I think the photograph breathes when no one else is watching." That line, "the photograph breathes," would later become a phrase repeated by students who stumbled across his writings. For Alderman, who spent his life uncovering Nevada's history, it seemed the past had reached out and pressed against him in ways he could not explain. Local historians began comparing the wedding photograph to other strange images from Nevada's early days. They found several examples where blurred figures appeared in photographs of miners, townsfolk, even schoolchildren. Some were easily dismissed as accidents of light or long exposures, but a few stood out. One particularly unsettling photograph from 1871 showed a group of miners posing proudly outside the entrance of a shaft. At the far left, nearly obscured by shadow, was a man whose face was gaunt, his body slightly transparent. No record named him, and no miner present could later recall anyone standing in that spot. That photograph, like Clara's, carried with it a weight that unsettled those who looked too long. As connections like this were drawn, folklore came alive again in Virginia City. Old ghost tales that had once been told to frighten children now took on new meaning. Stories circulated of miners who returned to the surface long after they were buried, of men who appeared in saloons weeks after their deaths, of women seen walking the streets long after their funerals. Clara's wedding photograph seen too give these tales a kind of proof. The past was not gone. It lingered, sometimes captured in silver nitrate and glass. But the photograph's journey did not end with Alderman. After his death, it was loaned to a historical society in Carson City. There it was displayed in a modest glass case, labeled simply as Hayes Blake Wedding, Virginia City, 1895. Visitors passed by, some pausing only briefly, others drawn in by something they could not quite name. Staff members began to notice that those who lingered often walked away unsettled. One woman claimed she felt faint after looking too closely at the mysterious figure. A man visiting from Sacramento said the eyes seemed to bore into him, like a father watching a thief. A child cried when his mother lifted him to see, saying he didn't like the angry man. The staff grew uneasy themselves. At night, when the museum was empty, one guard swore he heard footsteps in the gallery when no one else was there. Another claimed the glass case sometimes showed faint fog on the inside, as though someone had breathed against it. No amount of cleaning stopped it. These stories spread quietly, never making the newspapers, but passing from person to person until the photograph became infamous in certain circles. Paranormal investigators eventually came to see it, though most were turned away by the Historical Society, which feared sensationalism. Yet rumors leaked. Tape recordings made in the gallery supposedly caught faint knocking sounds, and one photograph taken of the display case allegedly showed an extra hand pressed against the glass. Though no one had been near it, the Hayes descendants, still alive in California, were deeply conflicted. To them, the photograph was part of their family's history, but they grew tired of hearing it spoken of as haunted. One granddaughter of Clara insisted the figure was simply a miner passing through town, forgotten by time, nothing more. But others in the family whispered that Clara herself had once confessed, late in her life, that she felt followed by someone unseen. Whatever the truth, the photograph seemed bound to her story. Clara's life had been marked by tragedy, but it also carried a resilience that echoed through her descendants. Despite her losses, she had continued on, raising 2 children who survived into adulthood, keeping her home steady even as the world around her shifted. To many, she became a symbol of frontier strength. And yet, there was always that shadow behind her, the figure who had entered her wedding day uninvited and refused to leave Dot by the early 1990s. Researchers began to look beyond Clara's personal history and deeper into Nevada itself. The land carried layers of grief that seemed to seep into its soil. Virginia City, once alive with wealth and laughter, had long since quieted into a relic. Its graveyards overflowed with men who had died, too young, their markers leaning in the dry wind. Fires had destroyed entire sections of the town more than once, leaving behind stories of families lost in the smoke. The mines themselves were considered cursed by many who worked them. Some historians began to argue that the figure in the photograph was not a single man at all, but a symbol, the embodiment of the countless souls who had been swallowed by the earth, whose stories had never been told. In their eyes, the photograph had simply captured the weight of Nevada's past, pressing itself into one frozen moment. Yet others insisted on a more personal connection. They returned to the story of Josiah Pike, the miner whose body was never recovered. They studied his life, what little was known of it, and found details that were chilling in their closeness. Pike had been engaged once to a woman who lived only a few blocks from where Clara's church later stood. That woman had died of fever in 1868, just months before Pike himself vanished in the mine. Some whispered that Pike had never found peace, that his spirit lingered near the place where his love was buried, unable to rest. When Clara married Thomas in that same church, was Pike drawn back by the echo of what he had lost? Was his gaze fixed not on Clara herself, but on the memory? She represented the bride he never had? Such theories walked the line between history and ghost story, but they found fertile ground in the minds of those who studied the photograph. Every theory only deepened the mystery. Every discovery raised more questions. The strangest turn came in 1995, exactly 100 years after the wedding. During a commemorative exhibition of Nevada history, the photograph was once again displayed. On the second night of the exhibition, an elderly man collapsed in front of the image. When revived, he insisted he had seen the figure move, that the man in the background had turned his head ever so slightly. Others scoffed, but whispers spread quickly. A few visitors claimed they, too, had seen a flicker of motion in the corner of the frame. The exhibition staff dismissed it as nerves, tricks of the eye, the power of suggestion. Yet behind closed doors, they admitted to feeling uneasy themselves. The case holding the photograph was sometimes found smudged from the inside, though sealed. A clock in the same room reportedly stopped twice during the exhibition, once at 11:29 a.m., the same time the original wedding had been recorded in church records. After the exhibition ended, the photograph was quietly returned to storage, as though those responsible preferred to let it rest rather than stir the waters any further. But even in storage, the story did not fade. Writers began including it in books of Western folklore. Paranormal programs sought to dramatize it. Local tours in Virginia City told visitors of the ghost groom, Though historians always corrected them, he was no groom, only a shadow. And among academics, debate continued, sharp and unresolved. Was it simply an unknown guest? A vagabond? Never remembered? A photographic flaw? Or was it something far stranger, a fragment of Nevada's restless past, caught forever in silver and light? Clara's descendants, though weary of the attention, could not escape the photograph's pull. Some admitted to dreaming of the man even without seeing the picture. Others avoided speaking of it altogether. One family member burned a copy that had been sent to her, saying she did not want it in her house. Another kept a copy on her wall, insisting that Clara deserved to be remembered in her happiest moment, no matter the shadow behind her dot, and so the photograph lived on, both cherished and feared, a relic that refused to rest quietly. Every time it surfaced, new stories seemed to cling to it, as though the man in the background still sought something recognition, remembrance, or perhaps simply a place to belong. For those who stood before it, there was one shared experience, a feeling that the past was not gone, that the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than anyone wished to believe. And through it all, the question remained, why Clara? Why her wedding, her photograph, her life? What had tied this figure to her story so tightly that even death and time could not unravel the bond? The answer, if there ever was one, seemed to lie not in the living, but in the silent figure who had stepped into the frame one afternoon in 1895 and refused to step out again. As the years moved into the 21st century, the Hayes Blake wedding photograph remained an artifact suspended between history and myth. It rested quietly most of the time, preserved in storage by the Nevada Historical Society, yet its silence was heavy, as though the picture itself carried more weight than any other object in the collection. When curators spoke about it among themselves, their words carried the hush of reverence, the kind of tone reserved for something that was both fragile and deeply unsettling. It is a curious thing about photographs how they capture not only faces, but the air of a moment. Historians who studied Clara's wedding image often remarked that they could feel the Nevada sun in it, could almost hear the faint shuffle of boots on the wooden church steps, could see the pride in the set of Thomas's shoulders. But what lingered longest was the figure in the background, the man whose presence never belonged. His face had been frozen into history by the simple act of a camera shutter, and now he lived on with more persistence than many of the smiling souls. Had stood alongside the bride and groom. By this time, Clara's descendants had scattered far from Nevada. Some lived along the California coast, some in Oregon, others as far as Illinois. Yet no matter how far they moved, the story seemed to follow them. Journalists occasionally sought them out, eager to ask about their infamous ancestor and the photograph that had unsettled generations. Some declined interviews, while others reluctantly shared what little they knew. One great-granddaughter spoke softly of a family legend, that Clara, late in life, had admitted to seeing the miner in dreams, always standing at a distance, always watching her with hollow eyes. Whether this was truth or only the embellishment of memory, no one could say. The deeper scholars dug, the more Clara's life seemed marked by the quiet resilience of survival, but also by an unspoken loneliness. Her letters, preserved in faded ink, revealed a woman who wrote often about faith, about endurance, about the wide Nevada sky she had once called home. Yet even in the happier moments, there was a tone of yearning, as though something had pressed against her life from the very beginning. Those who studied her could not help but wonder, did Clara sense, in some corner of her heart, that her wedding day had been shadowed by something uninvited? Did she know, even then, that her joy would be short-lived? The photograph itself became more than an object of curiosity. It became a mirror for anyone who gazed into it. Visitors who encountered it often found themselves reflecting not only on the mystery of the strange figure, but on their own lives, their own fleeting joys, their own silent shadows. More than once, people who had no connection to Nevada all reported feeling tears welling in their eyes after standing before it. Perhaps it was the solemnity of a long-gone era. Perhaps it was the heavy presence of a past that refused to rest. Or perhaps, deep inside, they recognized something of themselves in Clara's gaze, something hopeful, something vulnerable, something destined to be touched by sorrow. The most chilling accounts came from those who believed the figure had not stayed bound to the photograph alone. A night guard at the Historical Society claimed that on more than one occasion he glimpsed a tall man in ragged clothing at the far end of a darkened hallway. When he shined his light, the hall was empty. A researcher swore she felt a cold hand brush her arm as she leaned close to study the image. And once, in 2004, during a temporary exhibition, a visitor fainted directly in front of the display, whispering the words, "He's here." Before losing consciousness, such stories were never officially recorded. Institutions do not welcome reputations of haunting. Yet in whispers and quiet confessions, those who worked near the photograph admitted their unease. Some refused to be alone with it. Others hurried their tasks when closing time neared. To them, it was not simply a piece of paper. It was a doorway, and they were never sure what might come through. Still, historians tried to ground the story. In fact, they studied census records, marriage ledgers, miners' logs, death registers. They compared the clothing of the figure to known fashions of the 1860s and 1870s. They tracked down every theory about Josiah Pike, about unrecorded guests, about photographic distortions. They produced essays and debates, but the conclusion was always the same. No one could prove who he was. No one could erase him either. The man remained, unyielding, his eyes locked on Clara for all eternity. And so the story shifted from seeking answers to acknowledging mystery. The photograph became a symbol of something larger, how the past is never truly past, how grief and memory leave imprints that cannot be erased, how love and loss are often bound together in ways we may never understand. For those who loved history, it was a reminder that behind every record and every artifact lay real lives, lived in joy and sorrow, touched by moments that left marks far deeper than words can capture. Clara herself was remembered with tenderness by those who studied her story. She had endured heartbreak, yet she had carried on. She had raised children. She had moved across states. She had built a life out of the broken pieces left to her. To speak of her was to speak of strength, not the kind written in bold headlines, but the quiet, enduring strength that so many women of her generation carried in silence. And in that silence, perhaps, lay the deepest truth of all, that even as shadows pressed close, Clara kept walking forward. What remains most haunting is not the figure's stare, but the fact that Clara never removed that photograph from her home. Through every loss, every sorrow, every lonely night, it stayed with her, standing on her mantel like an unspoken companion. Some believe she kept it because it was the last piece of Thomas, the last record of their brief happiness. Others believe she knew the figure was there and chose not to look away, as if accepting that shadows are part of every life. Perhaps in some way, she even drew strength from it, knowing that if the dead could linger, then so could love. Today, when the photograph is shown to the public, it is not introduced as a ghost story, but as a piece of Nevada's history. Yet, adieu. Those who stand before it feel more than history. They feel the press of time, the weight of lives lived and lost, the thin veil between the living and the gone. They feel, perhaps, the same thing Clara felt on that day in 1895 when she stood smiling beside Thomas under the Nevada sun, unaware or maybe half aware that a shadow had already joined her story. And so the photograph endures as photographs do, But unlike so many, this one does not fade quietly into an album. It lingers. It unsettles. It reminds us that history is never just ink on paper or light on glass. It is flesh and bone and breath, and sometimes something that refuses to be explained. Clara's wedding day was meant to mark the beginning of a life, and it did. But it also gave the world something else, a riddle carved in silver nitrate, a gaze that could not be erased, a reminder that the past does not sleep. Perhaps that is why historians, even the most skeptical among them, speak of it with a kind of awe. They are stunned not only by the mystery hiding in the background, but by the way that single photograph carries the entire weight of a time, a place, and a people who lived, loved, and left their shadows behind. And maybe that is the truest legacy of Clara's photograph. Not the terror of the unknown man, not the unanswered questions that echo through academic debates, but the quiet reminder that every life, no matter how ordinary it seems, leaves a mark. Clara's laughter once rang through a dusty Nevada street. Thomas's steady hand once rested over hers. Their neighbors once gathered in joy, and a photographer once held his breath as the shutter clicked. All of it is gone, yet all of it remains, pressed into paper, waiting for our eyes to find it again. In the end, the photograph is less about death than it is about memory. The man in the background may remain a mystery forever, but Clara, her hope, her sorrow, her strength lies on in that single frame. She is the bride who carried joy and grief in equal measure, the woman who endured what life placed before her, the soul who never set down the photograph that held both love and shadow. And so when we look at it today, we too become part of the story. We stand where the photographer once stood, staring at the faces of the past, and we feel the shiver that runs down our spine. We are reminded that history is alive, that it breathes, that it watches us as much as we watch it. We are reminded that even in a quiet Nevada town in 1895, on a wedding day filled with sunlight and promise, shadows were standing close by, silent, patient, and forever present. The shutter closed that afternoon, but the story never did.